Lord of the World by Robert Hugh Benson. So, if you don't know who Robert Hugh Benson was, Robert Hugh Benson was an English Catholic priest who lived from the late 19th to the early 20th century. He was initially actually an Anglican priest, but he converted to Catholicism, and his conversion actually caused something of a stir at the time because he happened to be the son of a kind of high ranking Anglican clergyman. And so when he converted to Catholicism, it kind of shook things up a little bit because he switched teams on them. But in addition to being a priest, he was also a writer. And this book, Lord of the World, is, I believe, his most enduring and famous work. It is a fascinating book, which is something of a melange of dystopian fiction, social commentary, and Christian eschatology. And it's all mixed together to pretty intriguing effect, I think. And I'm going to tell you all about it. So, what is the story of Lord of the World? Well, it takes place in a projected speculative future, which takes place about 100 years or so after the time of the book's publication. And I believe this book was published in either like 1907 or 1908. So it takes place in the early 21st century, circa 2007, 2008. But it should go without saying, not really resembling, it did not end up really resembling what the real 21st century turned out to look like. But it takes place in a projected, speculative future 21st century. The book opens with one of the most artless info dumps I have ever seen in the form of a prologue delivered largely by an elderly character, which serves basically to just kind of set up the backstory of this world. And it's very much kind of reminiscent of like the Star Wars opening, just the text scrawl, and then you hit the ground running. So in the world of Lord of the World, basically the commies have taken over the Western world. The philosophy of Marxism, which is, and it's very important to note, is a materialistic philosophy, has kind of taken over the culture of the West, and faith, religious faith, is fading away. At the time that the book opens, the only faiths that really remain are Catholicism, because Protestantism and I guess the Orthodox Church have just kind of faded away. So all that's left of Christianity is the Catholic Church, and then the Eastern religions, whatever that may signify, and the new religion, the new hit thing, the religion of humanism. So in this milieu of faith, which is fast fading away, and the advent of materialism, we have a world that is poised on the brink of war between East and West. Our principal characters are Percy Franklin, a young Catholic priest, the kind of a member of a dying breed, you might say, and Oliver Brand, a government official, and his wife Mabel. These are kind of the main trio of characters. And when the book opens, like I said, the world of this story is poised on the brink of war between the East and West, but fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, just in the nick of time, there arrives on the global stage a mysterious American senator. Oh, yeah, and by the way, in the world of this book, America has annexed Canada. But anyway, a mysterious American senator named Julian Felsenberg hits the scene and seemingly miraculously negotiates peace between the East and the West and averts global war. After that, he becomes basically the most popular and lauded man in the world, and very quickly maneuvers himself to the presidency of the entire globe, pretty much. And even though the word is never actually used, it becomes very apparent that Julian Felsenberg is, in fact, the prophesied Antichrist. He is the son of perdition who has come to exalt himself above God and basically take over the world, which he does. And after he takes over the world, he begins making some serious changes by effectively outlawing religious faith besides that of materialistic humanism. That means Catholicism is the main thing on the chopping block. So Catholicism, Christianity is outlawed, and humanism is now the order of the day. And those who don't comply are punished in increasingly severe manners. So eventually, over the course of the story, Julian Felsenberg, um, the Antichrist character, destroys Rome, basically killing all of the cardinals and the Pope, or so he thinks. But in a kind of unique twist of fate, Percy Franklin, the unassuming young priest who is our central character, kind of winds up the new Pope because all the other candidates were killed. And so he takes the title of Pope Sylvester III, and he retreats to Nazareth, actually, with what remains of his cardinals and such. And there they kind of hole up and hide out. But Felsenberg's not through, and he is determined to see Christianity wiped off the face of the globe. And so he decrees that we've got to kill the last of these Catholics. And so the book culminates in something pretty interesting. It has a pretty interesting finale. I'll say it's very ambiguous what happens, but um, I think those who are familiar, I suppose, with Scripture will see what's actually happening. In the final days of the book's timeline, the characters remark that things uh, like climatically are not behaving as they normally should. The weather is all out of whack. The sky doesn't look like it normally does. The sun seems to be going out. There are earthquakes and volcanic activity happening all around the globe. And then it all comes to a head whenever Felsenberg and his minions go to Nazareth to destroy what's left of the uh, Catholic Church and the Christian faith. And it ends somewhat ambiguously, but I think um, those who again are familiar with Scripture will probably see what actually happens at the end. The final line of the book is, let me see, don't want to misquote it here. The final line of the book is, "Then this world passed, and the glory of it." That which is the English rendering of that famous Latin phrase. Anyway, so that is the story of the book. It is, like, once again, a pretty interesting and fascinating product, I think. But now let's discuss the technical qualities of the story. So, the writing in this book is good. Robert Hugh Benson could seriously write, and the writing really, really shines the most whenever he's describing the Catholic stuff, the Catholic rituals, the sacraments, and the various vestments and habiliments of Catholicism. He really puts his heart into it, and you can feel the passion behind it, and it's quite well worded. It is quite eloquently done. Um, it's a very well written book, so I don't really have much to complain about in terms of the writing. Now, as far as the characters go, we only really have a handful of main characters. That is Percy, eventually Pope Sylvester III, I guess the main character, then Oliver Brand, who is a communist government official, and his wife Mabel, and then, of course, Julian Felsenberg, the Antichrist. And the characters aren't as strong as the writing, I'll say that. The characters are kind of thin. Uh, Really, the only character who has like anything approaching an arc, any real depth, I'll say, is Mabel Brand, the wife of Oliver, because she does actually kind of have an arc, as she is initially very invested in the religion of humanism, the worship of man, which Felsenberg institutes and makes mandatory. But after she witnesses some pretty brutal mob violence against some remaining Catholics, she eventually grows disillusioned with this new faith and opts to have herself put down at a euthanasia clinic, because in the world of this book, euthanasia, state-sponsored euthanasia, is in vogue. So she eventually exits the stage that way, but not before seeing something. And again, there are points of ambiguity in this book, much like the ending. What happens with Mabel as she is dying in this book, she sees something which is never exactly made clear, but you can read a lot into it of what she may or may not have beheld as she's slipping away. But her character is decent. The other characters aren't. But I will say this: Felsenberg is, even though he's not really um, the most developed character, he does make for a damn fine antagonist. And it's very much in the vein of like the Emperor from Star Wars, right? You know how like in the original Star Wars films, the Emperor is just kind of this largely off-screen presence that you feel but never really see until the final movie, and that's kind of the same vibe here. Felsenberg, he barely even appears in the book, and he barely speaks. He only has like a few lines, if that. But you can kind of feel the threat. You can kind of feel the menace, and just how dangerous this guy is because of his charm and charisma. He does make for a good antagonist, even though he's not really developed all that much, because he's kind of more like a force of nature. But it works. So the character's on the thinner side, but there's enough to get it over the line, I suppose, just enough. But the characters really could have been deeper, I think. And now, as for the story, it's interesting. It is a very interesting story because it previsions some things, and yeah, I think it is valuable for the uh, things that it was able to kind of predict. But the plot moves along pretty good. It's not a terribly long book, but it moves at a good clip. I wasn't really ever bored. There are some lulls, but nothing that kind of like bogs you down. But again, it's a very interesting product. Again, mixing dystopian fiction, early dystopian fiction. But again, this I think was published in like 1907 or 1908. Very early dystopian novel. One of the earliest actually. But it also mixes social commentary coming from a very conservative religious viewpoint with the Christian eschatology of like Revelation and things. And it's once again, it's a very fascinating product, and it's a very unique read. It is a very intriguing book, and I was hooked start to finish. I really was. So to rate Lord of the World by Robert Hugh Benson, I'm gonna give this book a B plus. The characters could have been deeper, and the way it opens, the prologue of this book, is truly one of the most artless info dumps I have ever read. So that kind of took it down a little bit, but otherwise, it's a pretty great book. Honestly, it's very well written, and you can really feel the passion behind it. So yeah, to rate Lord of the World, I think I will give it a B plus. So now that I've talked about the story of the book and the execution of said story, let's talk about the theological and social aspects of the book. Let's talk about what the book actually says. Because I believe this book is a fascinating and, in some ways, a valuable book because of what the book says. So, first off, as I mentioned, this book is a work of dystopian fiction. It is an early work of dystopian fiction, one of the earliest, in fact, but it's not just on the ground floor of the dystopian genre, it is an inversion of the utopian novel. Because before we had the dystopian novel, there was the utopian novel, starting, of course, all the way back with Thomas More's Utopia, a philosophical novel that envisioned a perfect society. Because Lord of the World is kind of in conversation with certain modes of thought which were becoming more prevalent at the time of its writing, especially in Europe. Um, in particular, we can see these things kind of manifested in some of the works of, say, H.G. Wells. So H.G. Wells wrote a book entitled The Shape of Things to Come. And even though that book was written after this one, I think that that is probably the book more than any other that this book is kind of in direct conversation with, because The Shape of Things to Come is kind of the embodiment of the line of thinking that is this book's antithesis. So in The Shape of Things to Come, H.G. Wells envisions a utopian future in which religion has been abolished, science is humanity's new sinister, and socialism prevails. Socialism is the main mode of governance and economy. And again, that's a very rosy picture that this book stands to kind of subvert. And I think it subverts it quite well. And I think it's been vindicated in many ways because of its subversion. Because what Benson kind of prefigures with this book is the advent of Marxism and globalism as well, but in particular, a very materialistic philosophy embodied by Marxism, and kind of the ascent to cultural supremacy of those philosophies. And again, whereas writers such as Wells would have viewed such a thing as a positive in an optimistic light, this book subverts that and turns it on its head, and turns what, in other hands, would have been a utopian vision into a dystopian hellscape. But I think that this book was actually ahead of the curve in some ways, because later, after the book's publication, we got some experiments in that type of philosophy. And utopian is about the farthest thing away from what you could describe the resulting society as. In particular, let's look at Russia with the communist revolution. We had a society which was governed by socialistic principles, and we also had a society in which religion was largely abolished, because again, the Soviet Union started out with a strong policy of state atheism, and yeah, that did not end up being the utopian civilization that writers such as Wells would have indicated. It was a society governed by materialistic principles, socialistic principles, and anti-religious principles, and it will remain one of the most infamous examples of totalitarianism in human history, with rife with gross human rights violations. But this book, Lord of the World, once again, is kind of vindicated because it prefigures such a society. But I want to talk now about the ways in which it kind of previsions such a development, and that is because of materialism. The main conflict at the heart of this book is Christianity, faith in the supernatural being supplanted by humanism, and faith in man alone. And even though there are a lot of people that would subscribe to such a system of thought, I don't think historically that that's such a good idea if you look at the things that have developed from that. There is a quote by Isabel Paterson which runs, a philosophy of materialism can admit no rights whatever. Hence, the most grinding despotism ever known resulted at once from the experiment of Marxist communism, which could posit nothing but a mechanistic process for its validation. And Benson is able to again, kind of get the jump on those later developments in this book. But he also infuses those notions into a story which is constructed around biblical eschatology, such as the rise of the foretold Antichrist. Now, I want to do a little um, theologizing here, if I may, because I think, in addition to successfully prefiguring certain societal developments, Benson was also uh, in tune with some astute theological observations as well, which I will try to exculpate. So, um, the Christian eschatology is they're muddy waters, you might say. There are any number of interpretations, books such as Revelation, and how all that plays out, or if it has already played out, because again, the preterist view is that it was just talking about um, things that were happening at the time, and that's not what I'm trying to dispute. Rather, what I would like to draw attention to is the scripture referring to the number of the beast, because in most interpretations of Christian eschatology, the Antichrist is equated with the beast in Revelation. Now, uh, you may be familiar with the scripture, especially if you're a fan of Iron Maiden out there, with the scripture, here is wisdom. Let him who hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. Its number is 666, or 666. Now, the early church fathers used gematria to try to figure out what man that number referred to. And of course, you arrive at Nero, right? The Roman Emperor Nero, because his name comes out with 666. But later, Protestant sects often viewed the Pope himself as the Antichrist, because the title that is associated with the Pope of Vicarius Filii Dei, if you add the letters that have corresponding Roman numerals up in that title, it also comes to 666. But that's all beside the point, because what I would like to kind of talk about is what that number means, what the number of that man really means. So, even though Revelation was written in Koine Greek, the funny thing is that the significance of the number of the beast actually lies really in Hebrew. So, the number six in Judaism is a human number. It literally is a human number. And by the Genesis account, man was created on the sixth day, right? Also, it is a number of the mundane, of the material, because the world in which we live is a world of six directions. We live in a world of three, well, we live in a world of four dimensions, but we live in a world of three spatial dimensions. And each of those dimensions has two directions. What I mean is up, down, side to side, front to back. That's six directions, right? So man was created on the sixth day. The world consists of six directions. The number six in Judaism is a human number. It's tied to mortality, the physical, the mundane. But what's also interesting is that in Hebrew, to say something three times is to denote the superlative. That's why, like in Isaiah, when the angels around God say holy, 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 they're denoting the superlative, the holiest of holies. To say something three times is to denote its superlative form. And so when you say 666 three times, that is the ultimate in humanity, in other words. So when John the Revelator was saying it is the number of a man, it's quite possible that he meant that in a different way than a lot of people may have thought. That it is the number of the ultimate man, that it is the number of man at his most material, at his most humanistic, at his most self obsessed kind of. And that is exactly what Julian Felsenberg, the Antichrist in this book, is. He is the ultimate man. He is man divorced from any notions of God or faith or religion. He is the walking embodiment of the religion of humanism, of the worship of man. Um, he is man at his least spiritual and most material. And that brings us to the title of the book, Lord of the World. That is, of course, an allusion to Satan, because Satan is the Lord of this world, the power who has dominion over this world, this material, physical world. Whereas conversely, in the Bible, Christ said point blank, "My kingdom is not of this world." So we have the contrast here between the material and the transcendent. And it's so important that we not fall into the trap of materialism as people, because that leads down some roads that may not always end pleasantly. Um, there's a quote, I can't remember exactly who said it, but it reads something like, "When you stop looking up towards transcendence, you start looking around towards envy." That's why the abolition of religion may not result in the paradisical effect that some people might think it is, because the idea of God, of a transcendent reality, of perfection, is a very valuable thing, or it can be. It can provide people with something towards which to aspire, to better themselves with, to acknowledge that there is a standard, a superior standard, which we should all try to live up to. Um, but when we divorce ourselves from that, then we have a tendency to fall into materialism. When we abandon the transcendent and settle for the mundane, then we kind of wallow in our own humanity, which is anything but perfect, if you haven't noticed. Um, and that's kind of what the book is saying here, is that the rise of materialism and the fading away of faith, while some people might view that as utopic, you can view it just as well as dystopic in nature. Uh, Now, what's interesting also, if I may refer to another scripture, is that um, Felsenberg only hits the scene in this book in a milieu that is already prepared for him, in which people have, of their own accord, moved so far away from religious belief and descended into humanistic materialism that when he does come to power, he has virtually nothing opposing him. He can just waltz right into the presidency of the world. But now, like I said, let me refer to another scripture from Second Timothy, because Paul also gave some end times prophecies, and in Second Timothy he says, in the last days people will be lovers of themselves, high-minded, haughty, disobedient, traitorous, a number of things. But one thing that Paul does say in Second Timothy, which has always struck me, is having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. Now, that describes to a T the people in this book, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. Again, having the appearance of godliness, biblically speaking, a human being is created in the image of God, right? Having the appearance of godliness but denying its power, denying the spirit, the actual link to God, that transcendent aspect of humanity, denying its power. That is what the people of this book embody. They have the appearance of godliness, but they deny its power, and that is what just allows Felsenberg to waltz right into global supremacy. Um, and again, it is very, very important to uh, not fall prey to the trap of materialism, whether or not you are, Christian or Catholic or whatever. It is. I have said it before, and I will say it again. It is vitally important. It is of the utmost importance that we remember as humans that we are not just flesh and blood. That man is not nourished by bread alone. That there does exist within us and to us, a quality which is more than just material. But there is something transcendent about humanity. Because if you don't, then again, to quote Isabel Paterson, a philosophy of materialism can admit no rights whatever, and that's why the brutal suppression of Catholicism, which Felsenberg institutes at the end of this book, the total disregard for individual rights, that only is a natural consequence of the philosophy which these people have chosen to adopt, and a very dangerous, um, ruthless philosophy. But this book has kind of fallen by the wayside a little bit since its publication. It's not in the same ranks as like 1984 or Brave New World, but perhaps it ought to be because um, it gets a lot right, I think. I think that a lot of what it has to say has kind of been historically vindicated with later developments. Now, some of it I think was wrong. His assertion that Protestantism and the the Orthodox Church would just dissolve and fade away. I think that's not correct at all. I think it's a little too blinded by his own bias. But in certain matters of the heart, in certain matters of the spirit, I think it hits some nails on the heads. And for that, I think it is a very valuable book and one that may still be worth reading. So, yeah, that has been my review and analysis of Robert Hugh Benson's Lord of the World. A very, once again, fascinating book which mixes some intriguing elements into uh, a pretty striking product, I think, and again, one that says some things that may be worth hearing. So, yeah, Lord of the World by Robert Hugh Benson. Have you read Lord of the World? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said about it here today. And if you haven't read Lord of the World, I could recommend this. It's kind of an overlooked gem, maybe. It was on the ground floor of the dystopian genre, and again it's kind of overlooked nowadays. But maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe more people should read this book because um, it is. Uh, it is a good, definitely a solid book, and again, it has some valuable things I think to say. So I definitely could recommend this to viewers out there. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.